Good morning, everyone. Tommy, can you go ahead and share the slide deck, please? We're here Thursday morning, May 18th, to dig into CDA's Spring Housing Production Notice of Funding Availability. And this is a regular funding cycle that we do on an annual basis here at CDA, but this year it is expanded and augmented with a one-time allocation of roughly $10 million in home ARP funds, as well as a small amount of $500,000 in ARPA funds. So today, if we can go to the next slide, we're just going to start with a quick overview of who we are at CDA and our mission before turning to the NOFA, the available funds, their eligible uses and applicants, the evaluation criteria, bonus points, and funding priorities that we'll be applying. And then I'm going to try and get through that all pretty quickly and then turn it over to Bill and Stephanie, who lead our housing team to really dig into the particulars of how these funds will be deployed. So with that, CDA serves as a clearinghouse for a variety of federal, state, and local funds for the city of St. Louis. We are charged by Mayor Jones with leveraging these funds to drive our economic justice agenda to empower, develop, and transform the city of St. Louis. CDA has been doing housing work for decades. We currently have over 150 single-family homes in the development pipeline and hundreds more rental units that we provide gap financing on, although these are largely LIHTC projects. But excited to expand our housing pipeline with this $20.6 million notice of funding availability. Next slide. And you can see here just a quick list of some of the many entities that CDA funds. In addition to housing, we do fund a variety of public services, including youth services, senior services, food assistance, job training, homeless services, utility assistance, and more. And so we think it's really critical to be able to invest in both sides of the equation, in the neighborhood and the built environment, but also in the people. Because if you're just investing into the built environment without lifting up the community, the change is not going to be sustainable. However, the NOFA that we're talking about today really is focused on housing production. And the other point that this slide makes is just that CDA does not deliver any services, does not develop housing by itself. We are a clearinghouse and really rely on our wonderful partners to deliver the impact and bring these resources to the community. Next slide. So just diving into the NOFA, the timeline here is we released this notice of funding availability on April 12th, 2023, and we're holding the workshop today on May 18th, 2023, and we will be closing the NOFA on June 2nd, 2023. And our goal and our commitment is to make funding awards at the very least for rental properties by August 2023, well in advance of the LIHTC deadline. Next slide. And so what happens next once the NOFA closes and the awards are made? Here's just a sample and frankly, somewhat optimistic timeline, but that just details what the next steps are once an award is made. And that is that we will require the developer to submit final budget and design drawings. Those design drawings will go through environmental and historic review, including a Section 106 review by the Cultural Resource Office. We're also going to require a Section 3 compliance plan. And then we'll execute the contract, route it through E&A, get the comptrollers and city councilor signatures on it, execute the contract and the corresponding contractual documents, a promissory note, and other documents which will be detailed further down the presentation. And then we go into construction, and depending on the project and its size and its scope, that can take 1 to 2 years as well. But the truth and the sobering reality is that a lot of projects get stuck in pre-development on a variety of issues, and we're committed to working with developers to work through that. And it can get stuck in a variety of ways, and that's something that we're doing now, is going through the projects in our pipeline and getting those unstuck as well. And one of the reasons, frankly, why we can award it's an expanded NOFA of $20.6 million, partially because there's $10 million of home ARP and $500,000 of ARPA funds in there, but also that $10 million of home and CDBG is augmented by the fact that we have had some projects that had to be reprogrammed. And so we are committed to moving expeditiously because we need to deliver this additional housing for our community. And it's not in this slide deck, but something that was in a previous slide deck last week. It's just an overview of the city's 140,000 households and the diverse array of challenges that they face, in particular, those households under 30% AMI, which have extremely high eviction rates, and why we're so committed to really addressing the intersecting housing crises that our city faces, including by investing in housing as diverse as our city, including permanent supportive housing for those under 30% AMI who are at high risks of homelessness and eviction, but also to increase home ownership rates and wealth building, because we see a lot of tenants just lose wealth through their rent. We have over 37,000 cost burden tenants who collectively pay over $175 million in rent that they can afford. And so part of the solution there is to create more affordable housing, rental housing, but part of it is to graduate folks into home ownership. And so we're really committed to investing in a diverse array of housing with this NOFA. Next slide. And so with that, that is why we are focusing these funds to fund the acquisition, rehabilitation, and construction of affordable for sale and rental housing, as well as through the home ARP and ARPA funds, provide supportive services, rental assistance, and down payment assistance. And the available funds are $7 million in CDBG funds, $3.4 million in home funds, $9.6 million in home ARP funds, and $500,000 in ARPA funds. And we'll talk about each of those a little bit now in terms of their eligible uses. Next slide. And so the CDBG/home funds is what most folks who have worked with CDA funds, housing funds, are used to working with. And these can be used for both for sale and rental affordable housing for low to moderate income households. Low to moderate income households means households earning less than 80% area median income. Area median income, actually, there was just a new set of a new table released by HUD yesterday. And at 80% AMI, I believe the updated numbers is 56,000 for an individual and a little over 78 or 79,000 for a family of four. I'll have to double check that. And Bill and Stephanie, please correct me if I'm off by a little bit there. But that's the housing that we build with CDBG and home funds needs to be affordable for individuals making less than 80% of area median income. And we calculate affordability in terms of if you add up either the rent and the utilities or the mortgage and the utilities, does that make up more than 30% of their income? If it's more than 30% of their income, then they're cost burdened and it's not affordable to those individuals. So how do we deploy these funds? There's really two main things that will be, well, actually, there's the bulk of the funds will be awarded towards development gap subsidy. So essentially the way that works is that say an applicant applies to build a home that and the budget, the total development cost for that home is $250,000 and they can sell it. Well, on the market, they might be able to sell it for $200,000, but in order to be affordable, it needs to sell for $150,000. Then CDA can cover the gap, right, between the $250,000 total development cost, which presumably also includes a little developer fee and contractor profit, and the projected sale price of $150,000. And so that would be a $100,000 award. That's the development gap subsidy product and the vast majority of our awards. We also provide home buyer affordability assistance, which is in particular for for sale homes. We can attach a small down payment assistance, typically around $5,000, to assist with the sale of the home to a low to moderate income individual, although we are exploring increasing this down payment assistance. And then finally, it's not on here and it's very rare, but we will occasionally also award bridge financing if a project has another source of funds, such as state tax credits or something else. It's something that we will consider, although it's really only happened a couple of times. So those are the CDBG and home funds. Next are the home ARP funds, and this is a special allocation, one-time allocation of funds from HUD, appropriated by Congress pursuant to the American Rescue Plan Act. And these funds are really prioritized for permanent supportive housing, for supportive services, really for individuals under 30% area median income. So recall I talked about building a array of housing as diverse as our city, whereas the CDBG and home funds are under 80% AMI, and for both for sale and affordable rental. Home ARP is really focused on the eviction and homelessness crisis. It's really focused on, it's all rental, it's not for sale, and it's under 30% AMI. And critically, what we want to see is not just an application from a developer that wants to build housing. We want that developer to partner with a supportive services provider that can actually support the community that's going to be living in those units. And so what could this project look like? It could be a big multifamily project that has units set aside for 30% AMI. It could also be a tiny homes project. It could be a scattered site project. We're really excited and open to different proposals of what this looks like. And there's been a lot of research recently showing that at least for certain populations, scattered site can lead to better outcomes. But the key here is that you need to serve either individuals who are homeless, who are at risk of homelessness, which is really folks under 30% AMI, who are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, or human trafficking, or other populations requiring these sorts of services or housing assistance. And that's typically individuals with substance abuse or mental health problems that we're talking about in those other populations. And then finally, we have $500,000 available of ARPA funds for down payment assistance for low to moderate income households. And here we're really looking at attaching this. This is not to set up a sort of down payment assistance program that'll accept applications for everyone. This is really attaching this down payment assistance to CDA funded homes. And so we are working closely with SLDC to set up a larger citywide down payment assistance program where we're actually going to be creating a blended mortgage and down payment assistance product that isn't just a city down payment assistance award, but really leverages other existing FHA and MHDC products with favorable interest rates and other down payment assistance resources to create a kind of super product or multiple different more impactful products. But that's something that we're working on with SLDC. This is separate. This is just down payment assistance for CDA funded projects. Next slide. So eligible applicants for the CDBG home ARP funds, eligible applicants include both nonprofit housing organizations like neighborhood development organizations, CDCs, CUPDOs, CHODOs, but also private builders and for-profit developers. With respect to home ARP supportive services, however, we're really looking for nonprofits with proven experience serving these qualifying populations of folks who are unhoused or at risk of becoming unhoused. Next slide. Who is not eligible? Those who are debarred at the state or federal level, entities that have failed to pay city income and or property taxes in previous years, those who have defaulted on previous CDA loans, projects which the developer plans to occupy as their personal residence, development teams with conflicts of interest working with the city or CDA, and we do of course require signed conflict of interest disclosures, as well as, if we're starting a list of what we require, also CBI clearance, which is essentially proof of payment of income and property taxes, and a up-to-date business license, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide. So what are our priorities? So this slide is a little out of date. If maybe you can try going to the next slide. I don't know, Tommy, if you've got a, a more up-to-date version of the slide deck. I can talk through it, but this is obviously incomplete. This is not the latest version of the slide deck, Tommy. No. Give us just one moment here. I can talk through it while Tommy pulls up the latest version. See, there it is. You've got it there. That's it, that slide. Oh, I need to there we go. Apologies. But essentially, we have three types of geographic priorities that we are applying with this NOFA. The first is our Economic Justice Index, where we have created a composite score based on 10 variables, including income, life expectancy, educational attainment, violent crime rates, health insurance access rate, vacancy rates, property values, redlining, percent minority, and internet access, to really measure the decades of disinvestment in our city, or at least approximate it. We can't ever measure it perfectly, but approximate the geographies in our city which have been historically marginalized and disinvested in. And essentially, we will be awarding up to 10 points to the highest scoring economic justice geographies, and then really doing it by quintile. So if you're in the top quintile, you'll get 10 points. If you're in the second quintile, 8 points, 6 points, 4 points, etc. We're also, however, really committed to building on nodes of strength and investing near community assets. And so that's why projects which are within 1,000 feet of major transit corridors, of schools, of parks, of grocery stores, of health clinics, of rec centers, of public libraries will receive bonus points. If a project was within 1,000 feet of all of those, it would receive 10 bonus points. Most projects will receive somewhere between 1 and 10 points. And then finally, we are continuing to rely, as HUD has asked us to do, on the city's market value analysis, which really is just a measurement of the city's property market, and really prioritizing investments once again in those neighborhoods and geographies which have been historically disinvested in. In addition to geographic priorities, we also have priority property types. And these include the development of CDA assisted properties with an expiring HUD timeliness deadline. The idea here is that there's about over 100, close to 200 properties that CDA acquired with HUD funds. And unless we develop those within a certain time frame, we will be required to pay those HUD funds back. And so developing them is a priority for us. In addition, we are also prioritizing the development of city-owned property, including LRA-owned property, as well as the rehabilitation of vacant buildings, and whether those are owned by the city or not. Next slide is, I believe it has the following ones on there as well. But essentially, to continue these bonus points, we are also prioritizing. No, go back to the, yeah. We're also prioritizing projects with a total development cost of less than $250,000 per unit, as well as projects supporting individuals or families of under 50% AMI and under 30% AMI. We also want to support projects that implement neighborhood plan priorities and that are supported by community stakeholders. Projects which implement the Sustainability Plan Action Agenda, which includes Energy Star, but also goes far beyond that in terms of including trees, including green space, permeable parking, or what have you. And there's a variety of other opportunities to implement the Sustainability Plan Action Agenda. We also know that a big need in our community is projects for larger families. So we are prioritizing proposals with 3+ bedroom units. And then we're also really committed to building quality, durable housing that will stand the test of time, which is why we are encouraging applicants to use cement board, LP smart board, or really anything that's not vinyl. We also encourage thicker drywall for interior partition and perimeter walls. And then finally, we really want to encourage applicants who are city residents or incorporated in the city. Next slide. So with that, I will pass it over to Bill and Stephanie. They'll recap, there's a little bit of duplication in these slides here with some of the eligible uses, but then they'll really dive into the application materials and process. So Bill, over to you.
Okay, thank you. So as mentioned before, our funds for a block grant and home in particular will have eligible uses and include acquisition, rehab, construction of affordable either for sale housing or rental housing, and has to meet a national objective. The two that are eligible under block grant are low to moderate income, which is 80% or less of the area median income, or removal of sums of blight. But since we are focusing on affordable housing, the removal of sums of blight really won't be applicable. And we will, as Noel mentioned earlier, going to be offering gap funding for projects utilizing home or block grant funds. It may appear that we would mix block grant and home in a single project, but we're not going to do that. So either block grant or home funds, and then or home ARP if that's applicable. Next slide, please. Okay, so we kind of went over all of this already. Next slide, please. Let me go backwards. Okay, I am going to turn over this section to Stephanie because she's our resident expert on the home ARP.
I don't know about expert, but I will. I'll share what I do know. So the home ARP affordable rental housing is also for the acquisition, rehabilitation, or construction of affordable rental housing only. And as Noel mentioned, the home ARP funds are targeted for qualifying populations, including homeless, at risk of homelessness, fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, or human trafficking, and other populations who do not fall under one of the above, but still require similar services. So HUD and CDA recognize that there are many challenges to developing affordable rental housing for families who will be contributing little to nothing towards rent. So in order to assist with the financial viability of operating costs, CDA has diversified the home ARP allocation to include supportive services, which is a unique activity allowable under home ARP that is not typically available under regular home funding. And this allows for rental assistance and other tenant financial assistance to boost the development's financial viability through the compliance period. The compliance period for home ARP has been set at 15 years, regardless of award amount, which will allow developers to receive greater amounts of funding without an increased compliance period. Next slide, please. So in addition, HUD has exercised a statute allowing for a percentage of home ARP units to be restricted for slightly higher income families. So with that, not less than 70% of the total home ARP rental units must be restricted for occupancy by qualifying households at the time of the household's initial occupancy. These are known as the QP units. Not more than 30% of the total home ARP units may be restricted for occupancy by low-income households. So those portions may vary, meaning you could have more than 70% for QPs and less than 30% for low income. But the low income units assisted with home ARP are only allowable within projects that are serving QPs. Next slide, please. Additional consideration will be given to projects that meet one or more of the following, similar to the CDBG and home, involving CDA assisted or city-owned properties, multiple city-owned properties, developed in coordination or other targeted, with other targeted neighborhood investments, projects that exceed Energy Star standards, ownership and property management to be undertaken by a local individual, a partnership or corporation. Sorry, my screen was blacked. And creation of mixed income housing environments, those that are located near public transportation and demonstrate strong community support. Next slide, please. Home ARP supportive services may be used to provide a wide range of supportive services. We will get into some of these specific eligible costs in some upcoming slides, but there are basically 3 categories of services that can be provided through home ARP supportive services. That includes McKinney-Vento, which is homelessness and homeless services, homelessness prevention services, and housing counseling. Next slide, please. Okay. So once again, the supportive services must service the qualifying populations, and we will provide bonus points to applications proposed for, for services to be provided at the location of the home ARP development of CDA or LRA properties, services to be provided at the location of home ARP rehabilitation of vacant buildings, services that implement the neighborhood plan, services that implement the SLDC Economic Justice Action Plan priorities, and project features that implement sustainability plan action agenda items. Next slide, please. Okay, and Bill, would you like to go into the eligible projects for CDBG and home?
Okay, so again, we kind of covered this before, but for our block grant in home, we're focusing on for sale housing developments, rental housing developments, mixed use housing developments are eligible, but CDA funding from this NOFA can only be used for the housing portion. So if there's maybe like commercial on the first floor, we're not going to fund the commercial component, but if there was apartments, say on the second floor or the third floor, we would provide funding for that. Rehab, certainly that's a focus of ours because as Noel mentioned, we do own a number of properties, and as they continue to be vacant, deterioration is going to continue to occur. So rehab would be something we would focus on and would like to see done. New construction as well. And then Stephanie just kind of talked about the home ARP eligible uses. And one thing also we want to point out is we do want to avoid demolition where possible. It's very difficult to get approval to demolish a building that has federal funds either in it with the acquisition or by providing federal funds to demolish a building. It's very difficult to do that. So we'd like to avoid that if all possible. Right, next slide, please. Okay, Stephanie, I will turn this one back over to you.
Okay, thank you. So here we'll get into some of the specific eligible costs for the home ARP supportive services. Under the McKinney-Vento and homeless prevention eligible services fall into categories including financial assistance, case management, outreach and education, mental health, substance abuse treatment and services for special populations, mediation and legal services, and credit repair. So I'll go a little bit deeper into this, and these are all specifically outlined in the NOFA for your reference. But these specific eligible costs include childcare, education services, employment assistance and job training, food, housing search and counseling services, legal services, life skills training, mental health services, outpatient health services, outreach services, substance abuse treatment services, transportation, case management, mediation, credit repair, landlord-tenant liaison, services for special populations, financial assistance costs. And one layer deeper with the financial assistance costs, that includes eligibility of rental application fees, security deposits, utility payments, and moving costs, first and last month's rent, payment of rental arrears, short and medium-term financial assistance. Housing counseling topics. The housing counseling must be performed by HUD certified counseling agencies, which there is a list of those agencies available on the HUD website. Housing counseling topics, again, these are listed in the NOFA as well for your reference. Housing counseling topics include HUD rental and rent subsidy programs, other state, federal, or local assistance, fair housing, rental search assistance, landlord-tenant laws, lease terms, rent delinquency, referrals to local, state, and federal resources. Also, eligible topics include pre-purchase home buying topics, including advance advice regarding readiness and preparation, Federal Housing Administration, insured financing, housing selection and mobility, housing search assistance, fair housing and predatory lending, budgeting and credit, loan product comparison, purchase procedures and closing costs, referrals to state, local, and federal resources, and finally, homeless services topics. This includes homeless assistance information regarding emergency shelter, other emergency services, transitional housing, and referral to local, state, and federal sources. Let's see, ineligible housing counseling services. These are services that are not eligible for funding under home ARP supportive services. Resolving or preventing mortgage delinquency, including default, foreclosure, loss mitigation, budgeting and credit, or home maintenance and financial management for homeowners, escrow funds, budgeting, refinancing, home equity, home improvement, utility costs, rights and responsibilities of homeowners, or reverse mortgages. Next slide, please. And Bill, back to you.
Okay, so if you are interested in redeveloping an LRA property with a structure that's on it, you want to coordinate the access to that property with LRA. And in the NOFA, we have properties that are funded, or the acquisition was funded by CDA, and those are included in those exhibits that are listed there. You want to give them a minimum of 48 hours, and they will require that you sign a waiver Sonetta Wright is the contact person for that. And we're technically past the expiration of the period to access those properties, but you may be able to go ahead and contact them and make arrangements to get in there and see it. I would suggest that nobody would submit a proposal on rehabbing a property that they've not been inside to know what the conditions are. So just, I would strongly suggest that you do that. It would be very difficult to come up with the true cost if you don't know the true conditions of the property. The waiver requirement is because some of those properties may not be in the best shape. So you want to make sure, that you're very cautious and careful. You don't want to fall through a floor, through a stair, or anything like that. And then it's also important to note that the staff at LRA cannot answer any questions about the process or the guidelines or the regulations concerning the NOFA. We are, besides today, we are what's known as a quiet period, where we're not allowed to answer questions directly from individuals. You would have to submit a question to our NOFA email address so that we can answer that. And we would post your question and answers, our answer rather, so that all the participants and folks interested in this NOFA can access those questions and the answers. That way nobody is given, inside information, so to speak, that everybody else doesn't have, because this is a competitive NOFA. So we want to make sure that everybody has access to the same information. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so there's a checklist of various materials that are required to be submitted. Please make sure that you submit all of those. Any omissions could cause your application not to be considered for funding. But they're in the NOFA itself. We won't go into them in too much detail, but there's an applicant organization profile, which tells us about your development team. Who is the developer, who is the general contractor, who is your architect, different things like that. A summary of the proposed project. And, a lot of our application documents are either in Excel or they may be a PDF. If there is something that you think is important for us to know about your project, that's not, and there's limitations in those spaces, please type a letter and explain your project to us. It's better to have more information than less information. So we would encourage that. There is a spreadsheet for the application. We do need the Excel version because if you send it to us as a PDF, sometimes if you're familiar with working with Excel, there are fields that when you print out the PDF, we won't be able to read the entire cell. But if you send us the Excel version, we can read everything that's in that cell. Please make sure that you also compile the application in the order of the documents that we requested. And it's not all jumbled together or things out of place. It makes it a lot easier for the raters if everything is clearly marked and in the order that we requested it. So again, we do need a digital copy of the application. Next slide, please. Okay, again, I talked about a little bit earlier, but the organization applicant profile should include, telling us about the experience of your team and an, organizational chart. That's going to be more applicable for nonprofits, but sometimes it's helpful if you have 2 or 3 organizations involved to tell us who everybody is. Your articles of incorporation. We need a copy of your business license. If you're a nonprofit, generally you're exempt from having to have a business license, so we would just need to see that exemption. You do have to have a certificate of corporate good standing in the state of Missouri, and it's a conflict of interest statement that's required as well. So we want to make sure that you disclose any whether they're a real conflict of interest or apparent conflict of interest. As Noel mentioned earlier, if there's a conflict with a CDA or city employee, it could mean your project won't be eligible. Some documents will be applicable to some situations, but not all. Not everybody is going to be a nonprofit, but if you are, we need proof of your nonprofit status, like a 501c3. If you have a board, we need to know who your roster of board members are. A CUBDO certification letter or CHOTO application. So if you are proposing new construction and you are requesting block grant funds from us, it is a requirement that a CUBDO has to be a sponsor to that application. And CUBDO stands for Community-Based Development Organization. Those are there are a number of organizations that are CUBDOs currently. Some may cover a limited area, such as maybe a neighborhood or two. Some may cover several neighborhoods, but you need to reach out to that CUBDO. If you are going to apply to us as a CUBDO, you can submit an application to become a CUBDO, and we have that on our website. Basically, the board composition is the main thing to be certified as a CUBDO, and you have to have a certain percentage of your board that is low to moderate income individuals. A CHOTO application, that stands for Community Housing Development Organization. That is only applicable to home funded projects, and you can request home funds. You don't necessarily have to be a CHOTO organization. I would just say that 15% of our entire home allocation has to be designated for CHOTO projects. And unlike a CUBDO, you just can't get a general CHOTO certification. That is specific to the project itself. So it's a project by project certification. So you can submit an application for that, and for the project, we can review that application as well as we're reviewing your applicant or application for funding. And then if there is some sort of partnership agreement, we would need to see that as well. Next slide, please. Sure. Correct. So the question was, how long is the CUBDO certification good for? And it's for 1 year. All right. Other documents are we like to see preliminary schematic plans. We're not requesting that you go out and spend $15,000-$20,000 for an architect to draw up full-blown plans, but we need to get an idea of what the site plan is going to look like, the elevations, the floor plans. Just give us a basic idea. Again, we're not asking anybody to spend a ton of money on this, but we do need to know what the plan is going to look like. We want some sort of market analysis or an independent appraisal. So on a for sale project, what is this house going to sell for once you're done with construction? And on rental properties too, we need to know what the rent's going to be on those. And then we want everybody to have skin in the game. We don't want to be the only funder on the project. So we would need some sort of proof, whether it's a letter of intent from a construction lender, or maybe the developer has their own funds, so proof of their equity that they're going to contribute to the project. But we need to have that information included with the application. And then this is important. Please don't initiate any sort of title transfer. So if it's a property you don't currently own, please don't, after you submit your application, go out and purchase it, because there are some HUD regulations regarding environmental review that doesn't allow certain things to occur, like a physical alteration or a property acquisition until the environmental review is completed. It's called a choice limiting action, and your project would be deemed to be ineligible for HUD funding if one of those actions occurred. Next slide, please. Okay, very important. All application materials are due by 4 p.m. on June the 2nd. Again, we mentioned earlier that we need a hard copy. If it gets in a hard copy, that's fine, but we do need a digital copy so that we can read all those documents. And make sure, again, it's complete. It has all the documents. An incomplete application will not be reviewed. So if you don't have a construction budget or something like that, we don't know what you're asking for as far as funding, so we won't be able to review that. All right, next slide, please. All right, so once the applications are submitted, we do review all of them. We have a team of housing development financial experts who will review that. There's an initial, what we call an eligibility and completion review, just to make sure that the applicant is eligible. Noel mentioned earlier in a slide about the applicants who aren't eligible. So we'll be checking for that. And completion reviews, we're going to look to make sure all the documents are included. And we do rate the projects as a, like I said, as our team, and we average the ratings to determine the final applicant score. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so this is just our checklist. Obviously, it's kind of small to read on the screen, but it's in the NOFA itself on our website. But there's a checklist of documents that are there. You can even see what we look at as far as the completion review. So that gives you an idea of what we're looking for and the things that we review and consider. All right, next slide, please. Okay, in addition, you can see that our rating criteria is there and how we score it. So it kind of gives you the answers to the test, so you'll know exactly what we're looking for. So that should be helpful to you as you're putting your proposal together. Next slide, please. Okay, and then this is for home ARP applicants. Stephanie, weigh in if there's anything in particular we want to call out. Is there anything?
No, it's similar. Just the same idea, so you know exactly what we're looking for and what needs to be included.
Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. All right, same thing. Next slide, please. Okay, so income limits. So Noel mentioned earlier that the new HUD income guidelines have been published. They will be effective June 15th. So, you know, you can look those up and that might help you determine the affordability of the unit. In our application, we have a tab for home buyer assistance, and there you can plug in what the interest rate is likely to be, and make sure, please, that you use current interest rates. Don't use like the interest rates from, you know, last year or 2 years ago when they were in the 3s and 4s. It's going to be probably 7 is probably the best rate to put in now. I have heard that they may creep up to 8%. So just make sure you're using the, you know, accurate information there. And I also mentioned that because a lot of people skip that tab on the application, but that's going to help you determine your affordability. So if your projected household size is 4 people, what is the income that's needed to get to that affordability? there's a maximum per unit subsidy limit. Now, that's only for home. I believe since we put out the application, HUD published the new guidelines. And that's really by bedroom size. So, it ranges from 0 bedrooms, like a single room occupancy, up to 4 bedrooms, I believe. And there's a different amount per unit. So let's say the limit for a 1 bedroom is 271,000. I don't have the numbers in front of me, so I'm not sure what that is, but you're asking for $300,000 for that unit from us, and you're asking for home funds. That wouldn't be eligible there. And because of that amount. I will also say too, that the maximum per unit subsidy is only applicable to home. It's not applicable to CDBG. Okay. And then just some cost standards for the development itself. So developer fees are capped. It's for new construction, it's 12%. For rehab, it's 15% of the development costs. And rehab's a little bit more because rehab often is much more challenging than new construction. There's also limits to contractor profit and overhead. And those are in the compliance tab of the respective applications. And then contingency, something I like to mention, make sure that your contingency budget is adequately funded. We have seen budgets that have like 0% contingency. And, if you've done a project before, you will know that you never have enough money, and things don't go the way you think they're going to 100% of the time. So you need to have an adequate contingency budgeted. I would recommend that you budget the maximum that's allowed. It's 5% for new construction. It's 7.5% for rehab. And then, we want to, again, see that you're leveraging our dollars with other dollars. We will not fund a project in which you are asking for 100% of the financing from us. We generally like to keep our funding requests at about 50% of the total development costs, but the lower you can go, the higher you're going to score in that section of the rating process. So again, we want to see, you all bring resources to the table. And then if there's something in the application that is unusual or outside the norm, please explain that to us. Maybe there's a reason something, is kind of, the numbers are kind of crazy or something like that, but there may be a legitimate explanation for that. Please explain that in a letter in your application. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so some additional things that you need to consider is something that's called Section 106 review. That is part of the a national act from 1969, Historic Preservation Act. Okay, thank you, Trey. Yeah, National Historic Preservation Act. And basically it wants to make sure that any projects that receive block grant home or home ARP funding are in conformity with historic preservation standards. So besides rehab, of course, it does also apply to new construction. So Jan Cameron with the Cultural Resources Office is who you should contact to, make sure that your design complies with 106 standards. And we do encourage applicants to contact Jan to make sure that their design does. I mean, you wouldn't want to put, something that looks totally out of context for the neighborhood it's in. She's not likely to approve that. But if you discuss it with her ahead of time. It can save you a lot of headache on the back end. We also have a set of design review guidelines. There's a link there to that at CDA where different things are considered as far as conformity with the HUD regulations and just good practices. Todd Jacobs is our architectural manager, so his information is there as well. And then Trey McCarter, who's in the audience here, and James Pfister are our environmental review experts. And that will be a component of the project as well. So things that they have to consider are proximity to like a previous industrial use. So if you're proposing to build a new house on next to a Superfund site or something, that's going to be problematic. Or maybe it was a gas station in a past life, or they have to factor in the noise threshold. So if you're going to build right next to Interstate 70, that may be prohibited just because of the exterior noise threshold. So that's also a federal requirement that has to be addressed. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so in addition to those that were just mentioned, there's other things that you have to consider. So MSD, the Metropolitan Sewer District, you should consult them on your project, especially a new construction, because maybe you're going to build on, several vacant lots and maybe there's no sewer infrastructure there at all. So you want to consult MSD in your plan. An environmental assessment may be required if for some reason, like I said, it's built on or you're proposing construction on or adjacent to a past industrial site or a gas station or a highway or even a major intersection. All those things are going to need to be consulted. And that also applies to rehab too, not just new construction. Lead safe housing. So if this wouldn't apply to new construction, only to rehab, and if the house was built before 1978, you will be required to submit a lead remediation plan to make sure that the home is, at the end of the day, will be safe of any lead-based paint hazards, all be remediated. Radon clearance, that is applicable to both rehab and new construction. So we don't have a huge radon problem in the city and even in the state of Missouri, but there are a number of homes that do have high radon levels. And if you just need a budget for putting in a radon mitigation system. Radon poisoning is the second leading cause of lung cancer after smoking. So a lot of people in the US die from lung cancer from radon poisoning. So it's important that we address that. Energy Star certification is the minimum standard, but we do score higher. Noel mentioned the sustainability guidelines. So LEED or green building, things like that will score you more points in that classification. Accessibility and adaptability. Once you get over a certain number of rental units, like 5 rental units, at least one of those has to be accessible. And, for folks who may have mobility issues. And this is important. New roofs are a requirement on a rehab project. So we do not allow a roof to simply be repaired. History has taught us that if you fix one part of the roof, you think you can patch it, that later on it'll be leaking somewhere else. Also, I will say that when you're preparing your construction budget, please have a legitimate cost to put a new roof on. I mean, we've seen some that say like $3,000. You can't put a new roof on for $3,000. So make sure it's a legitimate legitimate costs. Also, new sewer laterals and water lines are required. I mean, I know those things are buried under the ground. Typically, you can't see them. We may think there's not a problem, but there's a very good chance that after you're done with the project, that new buyer or that new tenant in those units may have a problem with their sewer or the water line. So you need to budget accordingly to replace those systems at the outset. Next slide, please. Okay, so some other requirements are compliance with the MBE and WBE participation goals. So those are listed there, and they're applicable only if your project includes building permits that total $1 million or more. Now, obviously, we would like to see great participation on all of our projects. We're going to ask you for that, but only when it's over $1 million or more in building permits do you actually have to get it approved by the MBE, WBE development compliance team that's headed by Stacy Fowler. And her information is listed there. And the ordinance number that, delineates what those requirements are is listed there for your reference. Section 3, I am going to let Stephanie talk about that maybe in greater depth, but if your funding on your project is more than $200,000, then you have to submit a Section 3 plan, and I will turn over Stephanie for that real quick.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to follow up just a little bit on the MBE and WBE for you. So it is noted on there, Stacy Fowler with SLDC. I think there is also currently, she has another assistant with this requirement, Marla Roach. So either one of those may be contacting you. Once your project is identified as qualifying to comply with the MWBE requirements, those ladies will be notified and they will reach out to you and set up a technical assistance visit, and they will send you an email and electronic versions of all the forms that are required, and they'll go over in detail with you what's required for your reporting and help answer any questions and help guide you through that process. Section 3, as Bill noted, the trigger for Section 3 is a HUD award of $200,000 or more. At that point, your project is identified as a Section 3 project. And Section 3, in short, is a HUD requirement that ensures that projects that are funded with HUD funding to the greatest extent feasible, provide economic opportunity to low and moderate income persons. So once your project is identified as a Section 3 project, CDA will reach out to you and schedule a technical assistance visit, and we will go over in great depth all of the details of the specific forms. However, I would like to provide for you today what some of the general reporting requirements will be. So once you are contacted by CDA and you have your technical assistance visit, you are then free to begin preparing your Section 3 plan. I do want to note that the Section 3 plan and reporting requires participation from all of the subcontractors on the project. One of the requirements of your Section 3 plan is to provide a sample subcontract, which includes this Section 3 clause, informing the subcontractors of their reporting obligations on this project. So your Section 3 plan will be submitted to CDA for review. Upon review and approval, we will issue a written letter of approval advising you that you are free to move forward with your project. This must be received, your Section 3 approval letter must be received prior to any issuance of reimbursement payments. So for your project to move forward, this must be completed. Once the Section 3 plan is approved, the reporting requirements include quarterly reports, which are based on the calendar year. Those are due on the 10th day of the month following the end of the quarter. So for example, the first quarter being January 1st to March 31st, your Q1 report would be due April 10th. As well, there is an annual report that is basically the sum total of your quarterly reports for that year. And then finally, there is a final project report, which would be the sum total of your annual reports for the project. So I'm not, some of you may be familiar with Section 3. Some of you may have worked on Section 3 projects under the old rule. And some of you may have already experienced the reporting processes under the new rule. But the benchmarks under the new rule that HUD is currently operating under is based on labor hours. So what we're going to be looking for is 25% of the total labor hours to be performed by Section 3 workers, and 5% of the total labor hours will be performed by targeted Section 3 workers. I'll give you a brief definition of those two criteria. So a Section 3 worker is a worker who either meets the income guideline, works for a Section 3 business concern, or is a youth build participant. Then a youth build participant. A targeted Section 3 worker must first be certified as a Section 3 worker and then also meet an additional criteria, which could be meeting the income guidelines or being employed by a Section 3 business, also a youth build participant, or live within a 1-mile radius of the project site. Now, you may have noticed that some of those qualifying criteria are the same for targeted workers and Section 3 workers. However, to be a targeted worker, you must meet two different criteria. So for example, if you qualify as a worker under the income guidelines, and then also the business that you work for qualifies as a business, then you can be qualified as a targeted worker. If you are qualified as a Section 3 worker because you are employed by a Section 3 business concern and you live within a 1-mile radius of the project site, then you are a targeted Section 3 worker. So for this reason, the benchmarks being measured by the total labor hours on the project, this is why it is critical for each of the subs to also participate in the annual and quarterly reporting. The next compliance requirement is the Davis-Bacon Act. So this can be triggered by 8 or more units of HUD funded, of CDBG funding, and 12 or more units of home assisted funding. So I'm going to invite Ruth Kenoy, our Davis-Bacon monitor. She will provide some more detailed information on the reporting requirements for Davis-Bacon.
Good morning. I am going to speak briefly about Davis-Bacon, which is the compliance that you'll need to have to show that you are paying your construction workers what's known as prevailing wages. You're going to have a wage decision that gets locked in whenever you start your project and get your contract together. And before I get started, let me just say that both HUD and the Department of Labor have some very useful resources for you on their websites. I would suggest, if you're not familiar with Davis-Bacon, that you go to HUD's website and look at their contractor's guide, which has a new addendum to it. It's very useful. It explains things in very standard language and also gives you links for where you can get the information online. And the Department of Labor will have both a poster that you're going to be required to post on site, on the construction site when you start the project. They also have the certified payroll forms, Form WH-347, which is occasionally updated. And that form will be provided on a weekly payroll, either manually or a HUD-approved database when you get ready to start the construction project. It's going to apply to all of your subcontractors. You should also be engaged with the monitor of Davis-Bacon, whoever that might be, so that they know when a new sub's on site, they're required to conduct some interviews with the construction workers. So that's in a nutshell what's going to be happening when you start the project. Again, you need to post, in addition to that Davis-Bacon poster, also a copy of the wage decision for your project. You are going to prepare, certify, and submit weekly payrolls. On the back of that WH-347 form, or on the database, there's a second page, which is the certification. It is to be completed by the person who is in charge of certifying your payroll, and the signatures on those forms need to be wet ink. They need to be original signatures. I think that's about it. You do want to retain records of the certified payrolls and all of the documentation for the workers, and you need to retain that for at least 3 years in your records. Thank you.
Next slide. Thank you, Ruth. Next up, I'll speak very briefly about Build America, Buy America. This is a new, very new requirement, which requires any project well, let me back up just a little bit. So because this regulation is so very new, they are rolling out the eligible criteria in different phases. So currently, the first phase is for projects that are awarded CDBG funds and receiving more than $250,000 in total federal funding on the project, and utilizing iron and or steel. So for example, if you were to receive, say, 100,000 in award of CDBG funds from CDA and 150,000 in home front funds from MHDC, and you are utilizing iron and steel, this would apply to you. If you receive only home funds, or if the award is under 250,000, or if you are not using iron and steel, it will not apply to you. And basically what this new regulation is for is to encourage and ensure that these materials, iron and steel, namely for now, is fabricated and or manufactured within the United States. Next slide, please. Okay, and Bill, I'll turn it over back to you then.
One more thing on the Build America, Buy America Act. It's not applicable to home funds right now, but it's probably coming at some point. So just keep that in mind. These next slide is applicable to rental projects. So we need to see a property management plan. Who is your property manager going to be? Whether you're applying for a 2-family or a 200-unit complex, you need to have a property manager. There are a lot of compliance requirements that are applicable to rental properties, like annual income certifications, inspections by our asset management team. If we're getting MHDC funding for that project as well, they will have the same requirements. So it's strongly advised that you have a professional property manager, especially because the compliance period is several years long. So it could be anywhere from 15 to 30 years, depending. We need to know what your operating budget is. You know, how much are you gonna receive in rent for the units? You know, what are your expenses? We also need to see a capital needs assessment. So, you know, after 5 years, what kind of things do you think you're gonna need to replace? When are you gonna need to replace the roof? When are you gonna need to replace the hot water heaters? You know, the carpeting, just different things like that. So a lot of times we see applications that come in that don't have this filled out. Again, this is only applicable to rental property, but still make sure that you fill that out. And there's also affirmative fair housing marketing plan that's required on rental projects. Next slide, please. Well, do you want to do this part, or do you want us to keep going?
I can.
Okay.
So we're going to announce our awards. Excuse me. We're going to announce our awards in August and provide all respondents with a written notification of status, whether that is awarded or denied funds. And we will also publish a list of all funding awards and recipients on our website. We will certainly make rental awards in August, and we will aim to make all awards in August, but it's possible that the others, we are just really under a deluge of applications right now. And so I just want to be transparent about our timelines may shift as we work to absorb all those applications, but we will certainly be making rental housing awards in August. Next slide. I actually think I'm going to toss this back to you, Bill, to go through.
Okay, so if technical difficulties. All right, thank you. So for those who do get an award, this is just kind of a little snapshot. We'll have a workshop for the awardees, in which we will go over what, you know, kind of like you got the award, what happens next. But there will be a series of legal documents that you'll have to sign for your project. So everybody will have to sign a loan agreement and a deed of trust, a promissory note, an allure or a land use restriction agreement. And if you acquired an LRA property, or if it's one of CDA's properties, those are held by LRA, a right of reentry clause will be invoked, which basically allows, if for some reason you don't proceed with the project, that LRA could take the property back. I've never seen that, and we don't want to see that, but it is a tool that they have to ensure that once properties are turned over, they're going to be redeveloped. And you will also sign a dispersing agreement, because all the payment funds will be dispersed through a title company, which actually works out well for everybody involved. It's a much quicker time frame. If you purchase a property from CDA, you will get you would have to sign a deed and a note for the acquisition of the property. That basically just states that the property was acquired by you from CDA, and that will get forgiven, the acquisition deed and note, once a project is completed. If you are doing new construction with block grant funds, your Cubdo and you as a developer, if the Cubdo is not the developer, but they could be, but if you are the developer working with the Cubdo, you'll have to sign what's called a neighborhood agreement. One thing I'll point out too, that's not on the slide, is if you do not get an award, please contact us and we will do a debrief with you. So that we can help you get in a better position than the next NOFA. So we will go over your application, kind of explain the way it was scored, the way it was, how you can beef up and get, you know, a better chance next time. I will say that sometimes not a lot of people take us up on that. But for the ones that do, they're in much better position and some of them have gotten funding the very next NOFA. So please take advantage of that if you don't receive an award. All right, next slide, please. Okay, this is just to let everybody know that we are an equal opportunity employer. We're funded by not only HUD, but that's a HUD requirement that we have this posting. But now Noel mentioned the ARPA funds earlier. Those come from the Department of the Treasury. Next slide, please. Okay, so contact information again. If you have a question, we are in this quiet period outside of today's, workshop, and we're answering some of them online in between presentations, speakers here. But if you have a question, please submit it to that email address. And then we will post the question and we'll post the answer on our webpage. That way everybody can have access to the same information. If you by chance applied for the neighborhood transformation grant, that email address is very similar. It's CDD NOFA instead of CDA NOFA. So make sure you submit the question to this one. Otherwise, there might be a delay before we get an answer back to you on that one. All right, next slide, please. All right, we will open it for questions and answers. I don't know. Go ahead, Steph.
I just made a couple notes throughout the presentation that I would like to add before we go into the Q&A. One is the certificate of good standing that will need to be issued within the past 6 months. We cannot accept, excuse me, a certificate of good standing that's several years old. And also, this is noted in the NOFA, but I'm not sure if we verbalized it here today, that the supportive services funding is to be submitted in partnership with the home ARP rental housing. So the supportive services should only accompany a home ARP rental housing proposal as well. And finally, I think two more notes. I don't believe currently that the Cubdo and Chodo applications are on the NOFA page, but I will double check that and make sure those are available for you. And also, as far as the website goes, we did get a message through the CDA NOFA email regarding some functional issues with the rental application. I just want to let you know that that will be re-uploaded with those items fixed. And as well, with any of the questions that are submitted to the CDA NOFA email, we do upload those to the webpage. We try to do it at least once a week if there are questions submitted. And just a note, each time that you go to the NOFA webpage, go ahead and click the refresh button, that actual circle icon on the page, just to ensure that the page does refresh with the most current uploaded documents. And that's all my notes. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. At this point, we'll open it up for questions, and we're working on answering the questions in the chat. So we'll start with in-person questions first. Go ahead.
I had two questions. I was online on my way here when you started talking about the AMI numbers for the CDBG.
Not at all. And in fact, I'll quickly pull up the updated 2023 AMI numbers. So these are, let's find them.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, I'll repeat the question, which is the request is for the updated AMI numbers, and that stands for area median income. And so we have updated it in the NOFA, but for 80% AMI for an individual, that's $56,250. For a family of four, that's $80,350. And so again, the requirement is that the housing that we build with CDBG and home funds is affordable under 80% AMI. With home ARP funds, however, the threshold is 30% AMI, and that's for an individual, 21,150, and for a family of four, 30,150.
Just for clarification, for those dollars in support services that you mentioned, those can only, they're not standalone, you have to be partnered with a housing.
Great question. The question is about the supportive services component of the home ARP funds, and whether those supportive services have to be attached to a specific project or an entity can just apply for supportive services. And the answer is that yes, it is project based. What we're looking for is an application that combines a housing development project, permanent supportive housing development project, and services. And so the services budget should be really tailored to meet the needs and wrap around the residents of the permanent supportive housing development.
There's a couple that I'm understanding versus the project features that implement priorities in the neighborhood plan. Project features
So for F project, the question was concerning the bonus points and F and G on page 10 of the NOFA. And the first one is project features that implement priorities in the neighborhood plan. This may not apply if your neighborhood does not have an approved neighborhood plan, but many neighborhoods do. And so if you can point to the neighborhood plan and where and how your project implements the neighborhood plan, that's how you would secure those points. In addition, while it's not so there's bonus points, and then there's also just general evaluation criteria that we use. And one of the evaluation criteria that we use is just kind of community support and support from community stakeholders. So even if your neighborhood doesn't have an approved neighborhood plan, when I say approved, it's approved by the Planning Commission. Even if your neighborhood doesn't have a approved neighborhood plan, you can still secure the points in the evaluation criteria for having support from community stakeholders, your neighborhood association, et cetera. Please.
I just want to let everyone know as well that under the appendices on the NOFA website, there is a link to the city page that includes all of the neighborhood plans. So you can click on that and see if the neighborhood of your project is on there and then access that plan. As well, the what was the other one? The sustainability plan. There's also a link for that on the NOFA page as well.
the question pertained to section 3 requirements and individuals living in public housing. I'm going to toss this to Stephanie because the section 3 rule was recently updated by HUD. And so Stephanie is up to date on the latest guidance.
Sure, yes. So there are actually two different types of entities. One is public housing and one is community development entities. So for the public housing entities, yes, that would qualify as the criteria. However, for the development entities, it is not a criteria. However, the folks who do qualify for public housing are likely going to meet the income guidelines.
Do we have any other questions in the room before we turn to some of the questions in the chat? Go ahead. Yes, absolutely. It'll be on YouTube on the City of St. Louis website. Any other questions? Yeah, it's not something that we typically work with. It really applies to homeless services. Sorry, was pertaining to the McKinney-Vento Act. And the answer is it's not something that we typically work with here at CDA, but it is a relevant act for homeless services and incorporated by reference into the home ARP guidance. And it details the class of supportive services which are eligible.
Basic question. If we are doing a project that includes 30% units and open to some home art funds or home CDBG funds, should we submit both applications or one application plus a home art application?
That's an interesting question. Bill, what do you think?
Good. So the question was if an applicant is submitting a proposal for 30% AMI units, should they specify home ARP or home or CBG? So the short answer to that question, let's just step back from the home ARP and let's just talk about CBG and home. We don't necessarily state that you have to say which funding source you're applying for. And sometimes we may say, you know, the applicant may have said CBG, but it's a better fit for home or vice versa. And as far as home ARP or versus home, I think it might depend also on how many applications we get overall. So, you know, maybe we have enough home ARP projects that we want to fund, but we have more, so maybe we'll just use regular home funds. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Want to submit 2 applications for the same project if that's not.
Yeah.
helpful anyway.
So the question was, there was 2 different applications. So if you really want home ARP, I would suggest you do home ARP. You know, but again, if we don't have enough, if we have so many great home ARP fund projects that we want to fund, and we have other home funds we haven't committed, then we may just give somebody regular home funds.
And I am just going to follow up really quick about the McKinney-Vento question. I was looking for the resource, so pardon me, I didn't have it immediately ready. The McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, Section 401-29 is the section that we are referring to. This is the section that HUD is using to identify these services in that definition. So you can just do a simple Google if you want to read the specifics any further than what's provided in the NOFA, the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, Section 401-29.
Thanks, Stephanie. Why don't we turn now to some of the questions in the chat? And the first one that I see here is if you are applying for renovation / construction costs for in-service permanent supportive housing, you have to submit a separate application for each building you are applying for. And I don't know if we can get Shauna on to clarify this, but these funds are for it's for new or vacant units. It's not for in-service permanent supportive housing. Unless if the permanent supportive housing is partially in service and you're allocating the funds towards the vacant units, then those vacant units may be eligible, but I do want to clarify that. Bill, do you want to add anything in response to that question?
If we can, if we could, you don't need, if we can ask her to get on, because she has a number of questions.
Exactly. Shauna, if you can get on, we can go through your various questions with you. Oh, it looks like we're getting her now.
Yeah, so I'm curious because the neighborhood beautification
Oh,
grant.
sorry, 1 second. All right.
Okay, yeah, so the neighborhood beautification grants for the same type of development. So I'm curious if or why some of this funding can't be used for permanent supportive housing that is already in service and needs, you know, ADA upgrades, roofs, tuck pointing to keep these buildings in service. I would think that this type of funding would be designed for that. And if it's in service and the agency is willing to pay displacement costs, so new floors or a roof could be put in, and that's written in the application, could that be considered if you're giving an explanation and you're keeping these units in service for another 20 years?
It's not something that we contemplated in the NOFA, which is really designed around bringing new units on board to meet the unmet need. The home ARP plan that we submitted to HUD was started with an unmet needs analysis that identified a need for additional units. And so that is the focus of this NOFA. I agree that there's an additional need around those repairs, but we'll prioritize the repairs for permanent supportive housing units that are not currently in use.
Okay, and then I guess that would answer my next question. So if you're the developer, owner, and support provider, then that would make me ineligible to apply for expansion of support services for existing programs. Is that correct?
Right, we're looking to attach the supportive services to the new permanent supportive housing units.
Okay. All right, well, those answer, no need to answer the rest because it doesn't look like I qualify for this one either.
Sorry to hear that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Shall we take the next one? Is Cynthia Duffy regarding home ARP eligible activities on page 18/9 1BD of the NOFA. If 100% of project units are restricted for ARP qualifying households per 1A, may 100% of households be low income or extremely low income? And so 1A would be that they are presently unhoused, correct? I'm going to toss this to Stephanie, but I'm pretty sure that. Oh, okay, 1A there, got it. Are restricted for our qualifying households for 1A, may 100% of households be low income or extremely low income? I believe the answer is extremely low income, yes. But Stephanie, over to you.
Okay. So if I'm understanding your question correctly, so by default, the qualifying populations are going to be extremely low income. I think what we're referring to when we talk about the split, the 70% qualifying units, qualifying populations units, and the 30% low income units. The 30% low income units refer to folks that don't necessarily qualify as one of the qualifying populations. So I hope I'm understanding your question correctly, but the the qualifying populations do not additionally need to qualify by income.
And I'll add there that the distinction is that extremely low income individuals are inherently at risk of homelessness as defined in 24 CFR 91.5, I believe. Whereas low income individuals are not within the qualifying populations. And the distinction is extremely low income is under 30%, low income is under 50%. Stephanie, please correct me if I got any of that wrong. Okay. Let us know if that didn't fully answer your question. We can expand on it. Another question is, there was a mention of a choice limited action and buying a property after the application is submitted. How are properties treated that were purchased through the tax delinquent sale but haven't been confirmed yet? Should those be confirmed before applying, or can that be done during the application process? Should it wait until after the award determination? I will toss that to Bill, but simply note that if you have closed on the property and purchased the property prior to the application submission, then that's not a choice limiting action. Over to you, Bill.
We're gonna pull Trey in, who is our environmental review expert to talk about choice limiting actions. I don't know, Trey, if you want to come down here, if you want to do it over there. It's over here too. You can read it. So I think, and I'll have Trey add, if you, the question was about buying a property purchased through the tax delinquency sales. It hasn't been confirmed yet. So if you have an option for that, the option I think is fine. It's the problem would be is if you actually acquire it before you get an award from us. Does that sound right?
I think that sounds generally correct. So it sounds like.
So it sounds like the process has started already, that you've applied and it's not been approved. We ask that all actions cease essentially whenever the project becomes federal. So whenever we give the award, the option definitely works, as Bill was saying, but being put on the spot, I would say that if the process has started and you haven't been, you haven't completed the purchase yet, if that happens prior to our award, that it wouldn't be a choice limiting action. It's once the award happens that you would not be able to acquire properties or dispose of them or commit any of those choice limiting actions.
Thank you, Trey. And nothing is preventing an entity from actually acquiring and closing on a property prior to application. All righty. Go ahead. Actually, it's certain, the question was, do you need to have a property under option or under site control in order to apply to the NOFA? And it is strongly encouraged that you do have site control. I think an exception is LRA property or CDA property where we have site control. Bill, anything you would add to that answer? All right. Next question is the MBE/WBE triggered by $1 million across any site/projects by each respondent, or if multiple buildings are applied for, will it be reviewed for each individual building? I believe it's joint. We evaluate the project and the award as a whole. Yep, it's the total project cost. Next question, when will the awards be announced for the May 15th NOFA that just ended? We are aiming for late July or August for those as well, and planning to coordinate those awards with this one. Do you prefer to see the applications for multiple properties on one submission or each separately? I believe that we typically accept them jointly. Is that right? Bill will handle this one.
So I think it depends on what you're applying for exactly. If you know, are applying for something, on one side of town and some other buildings on the other side of town, it would make sense to separate those into two separate applications. But like Noel said, a lot of them can be on a single application. Or the other thing I would say is if you're gonna apply for a homeownership and a rental project, I would suggest separating those out into two separate applications. Or also if you're applying for different funding sources, separate applications.
Great point, Bill. I was imagining just a couple of homes on the same block applying for the same funding source. You can package those together. You can bundle those. We actually welcome that. But as soon as you're talking about different funding sources for sale versus rental, those are all going to be separate. Does the funds for the rental grant include acquisition and construction costs? Yes, just as in for sale, our awards can fund acquisition, construction costs, development costs, etc., for either rental or for sale. I believe Stephanie Al's already answered that question. Will you please provide some additional details regarding how the funding works for supportive services? For example, for rental housing, would supportive services be applying for additional funds to pay tenant rents if they fit the QP? Or does the money go to an organization or business to provide services to my tenants? How does the allocation of funds for supportive services work exactly? Great question. I'll take the first stab at it and then toss it to Stephanie. But essentially, both types of services you just described, rental assistance and sort of case management and wraparound supports, all of those are eligible for supportive services home ARP funding. So what you'll want to do is a developer will partner with a supportive services provider, and that supportive services provider will provide a supportive services plan in budget to provide supportive services to the qualifying populations in the permanent supportive housing. And then that supportive services plan and budget can include both wraparound supportive services like mental health services and job workforce development services, et cetera, but it can also include rental assistance paid directly to the tenants. That would be tenant-based rental assistance, or another thing that it could include is that the developer and the supportive services provider could apply with a proposed master lease between the developer and the supportive services provider, giving the supportive services provider access to, say, 3 units in the permanent supportive housing, and then the supportive services budget could include the rental payments on that master lease. So it can take a variety of forms, and we encourage you to propose that and include that in your supportive services proposal and application and budget. Stephanie, anything I missed?
I don't think so.
Next question. Are there any exceptions to the requirements for new roofs? I actually think Bill just answered that one in the chat, if I'm not mistaken. And the answer is that there, Bill, feel free to provide that answer. But I think there may be certain exceptions for recently improved roofs or sewer laterals, but you need to prove it to us. But go ahead, Bill.
So for the roofs, I would say there's probably no exceptions. Just because, we don't know, even if the roof was new, was it done right? Was it inspected? Was, the sheathing replaced? What did the rafters look like? I would say no for the roofs. Sewer laterals, I think, again, I would say we're not inclined to grant an exception, but some things we might consider would be if you provided a sewer lateral camera inspection. And we would also want to know how old the existing system is. So, was it replaced 3 years ago? Or was it replaced, you even know how long ago, maybe 40, 50 years ago, maybe it's original. We're probably not going to agree to that. But if that's the case, you want to include that in your application. So maybe what the application is electronic file of the sewer lateral inspection and the proof of how long ago the sewer lateral was put in, but I'd say generally, we're probably not inclined to do that. Just because sewer lateral repairs can be very expensive. And if somebody just bought a house through this program and the lateral collapses, a year after they buy it, that could be a huge expense that they're not equipped to handle.
Thanks, Bill. There was mention of at least, next question, there was mention of at least one unit needing to be accessible if there are over 5 rental units. Does that mean in one building with over 5 units, or does that apply to scattered site with more than 5 units being renovated? Is there a ratio, for example, for every 5 units, one has to be accessible, or just one accessible unit regardless of the number of units? I believe it's a ratio of 1 to 5, but Stephanie or Bill, yeah, it's a ratio of 1 to 5. And it applies both to scattered or multifamily. Can the rental spreadsheet used for the neighborhood transformation grant be used for these applications if the rents and incomes are updated by the applicant? I don't know, Bill or Stephanie, were there any differences between the two spreadsheets?
Yes, I think there are some differences. However, for the sections that are the same, you can copy and paste. But I would fill out the attached applications specific for the CDBG home and home ARP funding on this NOFA.
Thank you. Next question, do we need to be MBE certified through the state, the federal government? Do we get credit for that designation simply if we qualify for it and it's applicable to us? You need to be certified through the city's certification program through the airport. Any additional details that either of you want to add to that one? And again, that's administered by through the airport, but also SLDC's economic empowerment team and Stacy Fowler. I also saw a question. I don't know if maybe we missed it or it was already answered, but it was about whether MBE developers and contractors get additional points. And the answer is that it is in our evaluation criteria that one of the ways that we are assessing applicant qualifications and experience is their track record of compliance with MWBE requirements. Yeah, I agree. I think there's a pretty fact-specific question here, which we will look into and answer. Next question, if applied for the May 15th NOFA, can we apply for this NOFA for the same property? Yes, absolutely. And in fact, it is encouraged. If it's eligible for both NOFAs, please apply for both. Again, specific questions pertaining to specific projects, we're not going to answer on this forum. We'll answer general questions, but can also follow up via email. Any other questions? What's that? All right. Any other questions from folks here with us in the room? All right. Thank you everyone for your time. I'm going to give 5 more seconds for any other questions on the chat. Did we get them all, Tommy? Do you see any we missed?
Looks like you got them all. Maybe by participants to raise their hands to ask why.
All righty. It doesn't look like we have any more questions. Thanks again and have a great day. Bye-bye.